Hello. Today we are going to look at difficult conditions for industrial workers. I find this time period in history to be very fascinating and interesting. I think it's pretty easy to find connections to situations back then to life today, and even maybe personal connections to family members who possibly even would have been working back then, or at least even if you can't think of that, putting ourselves in the shoes of the people that we'll talk about today. Before I click away from this slide, I just want to point out to you, this would be in a factory setting, probably late 1800s, possibly even early 1900s. But the picture here, I mean, you can guess how old these kids are. I don't know. I'm thinking 10 or under, maybe. At least, the boy that's in the front here. Also, maybe you notice no shoes, and he's at work. Clothes look pretty tattered. The second kid back here, some type of, I don't know if it could be a mask, or maybe it's even a bandage that he has on his head here, possibly showing some sort of injury. All right, but this is goes along with, yesterday we had Ed Puzzle about the topic of industrialization. Now we're looking specifically at the working conditions during industrialization, and this goes with U.S. History Content Statement number 9. The rise of industrialization led to a rapidly expanding workforce. Labor organizations grew amidst unregulated working conditions, laissez-faire policies toward big business, and violence toward supporters of organized labor. So, just an important fact here. I'll click away so you can see the bottom part here. That industrialization caused many people to move from farms to cities. And so why do you think that was? And I'll let you answer the question on the Ed Puzzle. Also, just of note, the U.S. population in 1890 was close to 63 million people, compared to today we're over 330 million people, so much smaller population. All right, I do not, think it's my place to get very political during, when I'm teaching and stuff like that. So I don't give my political views on issues. But this quote here I'll give you just as we look at labor unions from a historical perspective. So this is from John F. Kennedy, which would have been a quote he gave in the 1960s. But he says, "Our labor unions are not narrow, self-seeking groups. They have raised wages, shortened hours, and provided benefits. Through collective bargaining and grievance procedures, unions have brought justice and democracy to the nation," I believe it says there. Labor unions are a topic that today in 2020 can sometimes be political. People on different political parties, Republican, Democrat, may view labor unions in different ways. I think it's helpful when you're thinking as you guys get older and get more involved in politics, and you'll be voting not too long from now, that sometimes we all can be guilty of this. We kind of end up getting on whichever side of the political spectrum we're on. We can have an issue, and we feel maybe very strongly on the issue, but we sometimes don't see any of the flaws with whichever side we pick. And so to say that labor unions are all perfect or all evil would be, way too simplistic characterization on either side, and would miss maybe the flaws with either side of that. So there are problems with anything in our country, but strictly looking at it from a historical perspective, the development of labor unions in our country have a very positive impact on the life of the average worker. Looking at the working conditions pre-labor unions in America compared to today, as we'll go over, labor unions were a very powerful creation that helped improve working conditions for Americans when we're looking at it strictly from a historical perspective. So just keep that in mind as we go through this slide. So problems for industrial workers. One thing here is skilled workers start to lose jobs as machinery is used in factories, and unskilled workers can do the work that's maybe before someone needed a lot of skill to do, because workers just focus on one specific step, which makes them easily replaceable. There's a giant need for workers in America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There's going to be a huge influx of immigrants to our country during that time period. Some of us, have family members who came to America during that time period. That's where we can trace our ancestry back to. On my dad's side of the family, my grandma and grandpa, his mom and dad, were early 1900s. They immigrated to America. My grandpa worked in a steel mill for his entire life. He was 16, so about your age when he moved to America, and then got a job working in a steel mill outside Pittsburgh, and worked for his entire working career that way. So there's you may have similar scenarios too, but for people in America, there's going to be some people who are going to migrate from rural areas of America to the city, as we saw in the graph from yesterday. But you're also just going to have a large influx of people from other countries coming here too, because even if, as we'll see, the working conditions aren't great, the promise of them was probably better than what they were, but also it still was better maybe than what they left, which would be why they were enticed to come to America. Okay, here's another issue that we'll see is these laissez-faire policies that existed. And this would just be our government's approach to dealing with the economy. And so laissez-faire, you might remember that term from last year in world history, but it just means hands off, right? So laissez-faire, hands off. The government's going to be hands off. They're not going to be taking a hands-on approach. They're not going to have a lot of regulations that a business has to follow. They're not going to overly tax the business owner. That's going to make it more, cumbersome for them to carry out their business. They're going to try to just let the market dictate. If it's a good business, it's going to survive. If it's not, it's going to, fall off. And that's the approach taken by the government. So there is some sentiment of, keep the government out of my life as much as possible still to this day. And however, some of the problems that happened because of this laissez-faire in policies in the 1800s was a big issue was the creation of monopolies and trusts. And those terms, maybe you've heard before, maybe you haven't. You may have played the board game Monopoly and think, board game Monopoly, I want to take control of everything, and I want to have as many properties and as much money as possible. That's kind of the idea for a monopoly. A monopoly is when there is sole economic control of a business or product by one company. So monopolies there's anti-monopoly or antitrust laws that have been passed later. We'll learn about later in this class. But if there was an easy example, let's say there was a monopoly in America on fast food restaurants. That would mean that there would only be one fast food company in America. So that would be like saying if McDonald's was the only fast food restaurant, if McDonald's bought out Burger King and Taco Bell and Arby's and Wendy's and Jib Jab and everybody else, and they are the only company, they would have a monopoly. So if you wanted fast food, you had to go to McDonald's. If Nike was the only shoe company, they would have a monopoly. If you wanted a pair of shoes, you would have to go to Nike. There wouldn't be anybody else you could go to. Nike would be the only choice. If Chevrolet is the only car company, that would be the only car you could get. You'd have to go buy it through Chevrolet. The trust is another name sometimes you'll hear interchangeable with monopoly, but a trust is a legal grouping of several companies, but they're under one board of directors to eliminate competition and to regulate production. So with a trust, again, it's that same idea. Now, technically, there may be multiple company names. So maybe there's McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's, but they're all owned by the same board of directors. So they're all any profit they're making is all going back to the same place. That makes it very difficult for a new company to start up in that field. So even though technically, if McDonald's is the only fast food restaurant, anyone else could open up our own fast food restaurant to compete with them. The issue would be that McDonald's or whatever that monopoly company would have such a big control over that market for that product that they could even slash prices significantly just to put the other person out of business. So you kept going to them, and then once that person was out of business, then they could raise the prices back up and have a significant profit. Typically what happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, why monopolies became something that the government would have to address is they would often lead to higher prices for the consumer, and the product tended to be lower quality. There wasn't really much incentive for them to have a fair price or a good quality of the product. Okay, so looking again here at problems for early industrial workers. So we have this push, more and more people have to work in factories. That's where the jobs are at. You have maybe only one company that does that product. So if you want a job in that certain field, you have one business you can go through. But the early industrial workers, again, this is pre-labor union creation. pay is very low. It might be less than $10 a week. If you're a woman or a child, it would be even less than that. So they're going to pay you even lower rates. Immigrants would tend to get paid lower than people who are already living here. $10 per week. Now, back then, I mean, a dollar would go farther back in the 1800s than it would today, obviously. But this is very low pay, and the hours are long. You might work a 60-hour work week. So you're getting low pay, but for a much longer hour work week than the average worker would, work today in America. There's no such thing as overtime pay. There's no such thing as double pay or time and a half. Children will work. We saw in that early picture we see here, we see kids working. If you lived in America, and that's why, I find this interesting because you connect it to our lives. If you lived in America in 1880, you probably are not a sophomore or a junior in high school taking U.S. history class. You are probably working somewhere. You've probably been working somewhere at a full-time type job, not just, a job at Burger King or McDonald's or an umpire at like a local Little League game. You're working full-time in a factory type setting, or maybe if you're, living somewhere more like in a mountainous region, maybe you're working in a coal mine. And you've probably been doing that for 6, 7, 8, maybe even 10 years. You may have started working when you were 6 or 7 years old. So it would just be a completely different situation than what we have today. Also, injury at work would be a very big risk, but also could cause you to lose your job. If you got hurt at work, there wasn't anything like workman's compensation today. So if you get hurt at work and you can't do the job anymore, you're fired. If factory accident caused you to lose your hand and you need that hand to do your job, you're out of work. Unemployment assistance doesn't exist. So now while you're out of work, your family, if you're the breadwinner for your family, now your family might starve. There's no, that disability, you can't go on disability. That is not a thing. So there aren't protections like we have today in our country, which made it very difficult for those workers. So this does lead to the rise of labor unions. Again, labor unions, it may not mean anything to you, but for some people, this becomes a political issue today. And we're just trying to look at it as a historical issue. And labor unions form, and they work for, and they're successful at getting shorter work days. So the idea is, eventually it's going to be the 8-hour workday, that you have 8 hours to work, as that picture on the bottom shows. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and then 8 hours for what we will, for leisure time, for free time to, go to a park, have a hobby, whatever it is. Increased pay. Labor unions will, eventually there will be a minimum wage. Eventually there'll be a standard amount of pay that you have to get. Safer working conditions, so that, today at a job there is, certain safety conditions that must be met. If not, the business could be, in trouble, could be liable for an injury. That idea starts to emerge because of the labor unions. And then also restrictions on child labor. And some of this, it's not like this is all like they had the best intentions for, everybody in mind. Sometimes that child labor, why they wanted the restriction for child labor, it wasn't so the kids didn't work. It was because the kids were making less money than the adult and taking a job from the adult. They wanted the adult to have the job. So, yes, it's going to be positive as far as kids can go to school and they don't have to work backbreaking jobs at 7, 8 years old. That wasn't necessarily the primary purpose, though. Is more of we want to make sure that the adults are making more money, for at least in some cases. And how they achieve that, there's a term called collective bargaining. If you're a sports fan, you'll hear about the collective bargaining agreement between the players and the owners. But collective bargaining, it's just the idea that the union leaders negotiate with the factory owners on behalf of all workers. It's not just one person at the work site negotiating with the factory owner for themselves. It's for all workers. So the union leaders, they're going to, it's a union. They're a group. They're together, and they would negotiate. And then they would get these benefits for all workers. All right. So how, again, to go back at one slide, how labor unions achieve these successes, shorter workday, increased pay, safer working conditions, restriction on child labor, is collective bargaining would be one. But also there are oftentimes that didn't work. The owner didn't want to just sit down and talk and let the union have a voice. A lot of times they had to fight to get that, or take a little more drastic measures. So ways that this happened would be strikes and boycotts. So if you go on strike, you're going to, walk out of your job. You're not going to work. And if everyone at your place of employment does that, it might make the owner listen to the workers and give in to some of their demands. Or a boycott. Maybe people would boycott using a certain product. they would not go from a certain store or buy that certain product. Again, they're hurting the owner in their pocket, and making them less money. So maybe they'll listen and they'll give in to the workers. So that would happen. Sometimes, though, it turned violent, and you would have riots here. So some of these strikes became a riot. And there's three I'll mention here. The first one's Haymarket riot. This was in 1886 in Chicago. 8 people are killed during this riot. So there was a strike going on. There were some individuals who were killed by police while they were breaking up a strike. This led to rallies in this Haymarket Square area. And there were some people who were very, they were upset. They wanted to change, but there are also people who were more radical and wanted to use violence, or they would call anarchists. They don't support any type of government. And during this meeting, the police are called in to try to break up the meeting in Haymarket Square. And then you see kind of like a flashback here from an explosion. Somebody, and to this day, no one knows exactly who did it, but somebody threw a bomb that would explode near the police. And this would lead to police and some people maybe in the crowd also to open fire. And in the end, there were 8 people killed, 7 police officers, 1 other person was killed. 8 people would be arrested for the riot. 4 of those 8 people would be executed. But the court case, it was kind of flimsy evidence. So they don't know if of those 8 people, if any of those 8 people actually were involved in throwing the bomb or any of the violence, or may have just been kind of caught up in wrong place, wrong time, and were arrested. So maybe like a tragedy of justice possibly there. But this was an example of peaceful strike turns violent, which happened over poor working conditions. Other situation closer to home, this would be Homestead, PA, basically Pittsburgh, PA. If you've ever been to Kennywood or Sandcastle Water Park, you're in the area where this would have happened at. But there's a Homestead steel plant. Carnegie Steel was the company, and they go on strike in PA, upset about loss of union jobs as more machines are taking unskilled workers' jobs. And over a month-long strike, 16 people are killed. What happened is the workers have a sit-down strike, so they go on strike inside the plant. They just sit down and basically don't let anyone do the work in the factory. This group called the Pinkerton Detectives, so it's like a private security agency, is hired by the steel company to come in and push the strikers basically out of the town. It doesn't work, and it turns violent. And the Pinkertons, they have to flee. They have to retreat. But there are people killed on both sides, the Pinkertons and the strikers. And then eventually, the image you see here is you see the governor of Pennsylvania is going to call in state militia, who are going to come. So you have government troops, you have American troops who are here, who are now to fight against the strikers, and the strikers will back down to end the strike. But again, it's an example of a strike turns violent over poor working conditions. And then a third famous one, there's more than just these 3, but these are just some of the more famous ones, is the Pullman strike in 1893. This is in Chicago. So Pullman is a company, they would make railway cars, but that like have sleeper beds. So it'd be like the cars that you could, have a room and sleep in. They lay off half their workers and cut the others pay in half. And the thing is, one thing too, and this is happening in these other cases too, a lot of times when you move to the city, because workers had to move to the city for a job, they didn't have a ton of money. The pay was pretty low. So a lot of times the owner of the company had company housing, and that's where you would live. So you get a job working for, in this case, the Pullman company, and you would live in the Pullman town in their homes. And these would not be anything nice. It might be like a crammed apartment. They might be like row house, like kind of like duplexes, but they'd be really pretty small and crammed together. So your boss is also your landlord. So you're paying your boss rent. He's paying you money to work, but he controls your salary. So he just cuts your pay in half. He does not change your rent. So you're making less money, but you're still paying him the same amount of money in rent. That was frustrating to people. The idea here, what they're going to do is they're going to boycott, and they get other railway workers to go along with this, and this becomes a nationwide issue, is workers would not work on any trains pulling Pullman cars. When they came into a station, if there was a Pullman sleeping car, they would that was supposed to be attached to the train, they wouldn't attach it. If it was not, if it was already attached to the train, they would unattach it. What the government does, they start to hook mail trains up to any train that has a Pullman car. So if you are messing with the U.S. mail, that becomes a federal crime, and that's how they ended the strike. But again, so really nothing positive for the workers. Labor Day, actually, the holiday does come out of the Pullman strike. It's just like kind of like a bone to make the people seem like, hey, here's something for you. You get a new holiday. But the workers will not be happy with the overall result of the Pullman strike. However, even though these strikes were not extremely successful, they were examples of ways that workers could try to get better conditions. They can negotiate if the owner will listen to them. If they won't, they can go on strike or they can boycott. And so just to wrap it up here, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in America, labor organizations would often face violent backlash from business owners, and sometimes even the U.S. government would join in, possibly with U.S. government troops, or just a strategy such as attaching mail cars to trains to fight against labor unions. So labor unions were not welcome in America when they were formed. They were looked at as a threat to the owners and the amount of money that they could bring in. All right, to just try to, the whole kind of thought here is I'm trying to think of as many ways to go through as much of the topics that we would normally go through in class, but while trying to minimize the time and the amount of work that you get sent through emails from Google Classroom. I have linked to this. I have 2 videos that I think you would like to see. I encourage you to watch. They're not for points, however, but there's one. It's just a music video. A guy, Bruce Springsteen, maybe you've heard of or parents have heard of. But he has a song called Youngstown. So it's about our area. It's about the steel mills and everything here. So it's real short YouTube videos, just the music video of the song with pictures of things around Youngstown. And then the other one is a recreation of the Homestead Steel Strike from a History Channel documentary that also is pretty interesting. So check those 2 videos as well as answering these questions.